Hi there everybody, I'm Dr. Robert Cluley, and in this video I'm going to give you a brief introduction to organisational behaviour, which is course code BUSI1029, a core course for many of you in the business school. So this is a 10 credit module looking at organisational behaviour. The module aims for the course are, and I'm going to read these to get them right, to introduce you to basic ideas of organisational behaviour, to encourage you to develop an understanding of managing and developing people. And we're going to draw primarily on the major theorists and theories from organisational psychology and organisational behaviour. So I'm going to reduce this module aim down to 3 things. You should be able to identify major theorists and theories, you should be able to describe the basic ideas, and you should be able to apply your knowledge to manage and develop people within organisations. So we've got 3 aims really, which we're going to try to achieve in this module. So let's think about those in a little bit more detail. What we're going to do in the lectures is go through some of the basic ideas or core concepts. And let me just preface that by saying, when we talk about basic, we don't mean basic as in simple or easy necessarily. We mean basic in the way that they do in the natural sciences, where it means foundational. They're like fundamental, basic ideas that you have to know before you can develop more complex, detailed ideas. So each week in the lecture we're going to pick a particular topic, which is a basic concept, and then we're going to identify some of the major theorists within that topic. And you'll see there is some crossover, and it's a bit messy in places, and there's a whole host of theorists that we've not covered. You'll also notice, the astute amongst you, that almost all the theorists that we're working with are, male, pale and stale. This is not, unfortunately, particularly a decolonised curriculum, nor is it a particularly diverse curriculum. And that's unfortunate, and something we can talk about on the course, but it's also just reflecting of the fact that organisational behaviour has typically been developed as a body of knowledge by white men, dead white men, preferably. So each week we're going to have a topic and we'll look at some key theorists for that week. And we're sort of grouping the lectures together. The first set of lectures are going to be asking the question, why do we have organisations? What do organisations do? Is it a good thing that we have organisations? The next block of lectures are going to look at how people act when they're in organisations and how going into an organisation changes our behaviour. And then the last block of lectures are going to look at the effectiveness of organisations and how we can improve organisations. So you'll notice, in a way, the first block is going to be laying out some of the major theorists and theories. The second block is going to be thinking about some of the basic concepts. And the third block is going to be thinking about applying your knowledge. But we're adopting a bit of a matrix structure where these things all interact with each other. So throughout the course we've got theorists, basic ideas and applications. To support the lectures, each week there'll be some short lecture notes and some recordings. The teaching will be done by myself and Lubna Siddiqui. This is really exciting, and I'm really looking forward to teaching this course. I've taught this course for 2 years at Nottingham. Last year, with COVID and everything, we used a textbook. We used this textbook, and I have to admit, I find it really boring, and I didn't think it was a particularly successful course. And probably the student feedback would suggest that was true as well. So we've ditched the textbook because it's boring, it's expensive, doesn't really help you. And what we really want you guys to do at the end of this is not show you've read a textbook, but show that you know who the major theorists are and what they said. You can speak intelligently about the basic concepts of organising. Things like, hierarchy, bureaucracy, authority, power, leadership, innovation, technology. So we'll be able to talk about them intelligently. So each week we've got some notes to help you understand the concepts and the theories. We've got the lectures where we're going to talk through the concepts and the theories. We've got some activities, and then we've got recordings. So that's basically the course in a nutshell. Hopefully it's going to be more interesting this year, because for me, my degree and my research is all about organisations, and organisations are really fascinating things. What happens to people when they go into organisations is really fascinating and really relatable, because we all exist in organisations all the time. And I just don't think that the way we taught it last year got that across. So hopefully this year we're more focusing on the ideas and you understanding the ideas and engaging with the ideas than necessarily, like trying to consume 700 pages of a textbook. So that's what we're going to be doing on the course. Now, you probably sat there with some questions like, well, what do we mean by organisations? How does this relate to anything? What is organisational behaviour? And they're going to be in some other videos which I'm going to record shortly. But for the time being, hopefully that's given you a brief introduction to what we're going to try to do on this course. So quick recap. The course has got 3 aims. We want to identify major theorists of organisations. So we're going to be thinking about people like Max Weber, Karl Marx, Robert Merton, Alvin Gouldner, Elton Mayo, Carl Weichler. There's a load of them. And at the end of the course, if somebody says to you, who is Max Weber? Hopefully you'll be able to say something correct at the end of it about them. So that's the first aim, right? Identify major theorists. Describe basic concepts. So think about things like bureaucracy, right? You should be able to say what bureaucracy is, not like what you kind of think it is because you've seen some movies and some TV shows, but actually as an academic concept with a precise meaning, what does it mean? And then you should be able to apply your knowledge to think about how to improve organisations. So you should be able to, by the end of this, walk around and think, why is the university organised like this? Or why is a student society work that way? Or if I want to start a business, what's the best way for me to do that? What's the best way for me to organise? So I think it should be a really cool course, really exciting course. Hopefully you agree. If you've got any questions, email me. I'll try to put my email on the screen, but maybe I can't figure out how to do that. So it's just robert.cleary@nottingham.ac.uk. Have a look at the Moodle page, because we're going to post a load of things on the Moodle page as well. And I'm really looking forward to teaching the module. I'm now just blabbering on without saying anything important, so I'm going to stop. So in this short video, I'm going to talk about what do we mean by organisations, what are the organisations that we're going to be covering on this module, because it's a course that's called Organisational Behaviour, so it's about how organisations behave, and it's about how people behave when they're inside organisations. So what do we mean? What are we talking about when we talk about organisations? Well, the first thing to say is, if we want to be precise, what we're actually going to be talking about in this course are formal organisations. So there's a whole literature and whole area of study looking at informal organisations and social organisations, which are like, how you form friendship groups and, how you get together online and all that kind of stuff. That's not really what we're looking at in this course. Although we might bring some of it in just because it can be interesting. But what we're focusing on, what's called formal organisations. And by formal, we mean organisations that are clearly defined entities which have very set, explicit boundaries around them. Now, most organisation theorists say it's really difficult to define organisations in a simple statement, but then they normally go on and do it, and I'm going to follow the same logic. So it's often said, instead of trying to define organisations and then look for them in the world, let's think about what we're talking about, get some examples, and then think what they have in common. So let's think about some examples. Well, some that spring to my mind are things like the government, the University of Nottingham, the National Grid, Waitrose supermarkets, Apple, Facebook, right? Basically, most companies, most state or public administrative bodies, things like the army, things like the navy, right? These are what we're talking about when we say formal organisations. Now clearly they do all sorts of things, right? Starbucks makes coffee, the London Stock Exchange sells shares, but they're both formal organisations. So what do they have in common? I want to suggest, and what we're going to use on this course, is that there's two important things that all of those entities, all those objects, all those organisations have in common. So the first thing is they all are very clearly have clearly defined memberships. That you either work for Starbucks or you're a customer of Starbucks, or you have nothing to do with Starbucks. But even if you're a customer, you're not a member of Starbucks, right? There's a very clear dividing line between the inside and the outside. And for those people that are on the inside of the organisations, there are explicit rules, working practices, conventions and regulations, policies that govern how they behave when they're in the organisation. So if you get a job at Starbucks, right, firstly, you have to go and do an interview. And then you'll be offered a contract, a formal, explicit written document that says you are now going to become part of our organisation. And when you enter that organisation, when you agree to become a member, you accept the rules of that organisation, right? So you're going to have to listen to your boss. You're going to have to follow the procedures that they have. You can't get a job at Starbucks and start making coffee your own way, right? You have to follow the rules. So we can reduce all of that down to basically saying organisations coordinate the activities of their members. And we're going to unpack this a bit as the course develops, but for the time being, formal organisations have typically explicit or written down rules for how their members interact with each other. They coordinate what their members do. That's the first element of our definition. The second element is that all these organisations don't just exist for no reason. They all have a purpose. And this is quite different. So, if you think about the social organisation that I mentioned earlier, you and your friends, you don't form friends for any other reason than just to have friends, right? It just exists of and of itself, whereas all formal organisations have an explicitly stated goal or a purpose. The University of Nottingham exists to generate knowledge and transmit knowledge to people like you. The National Grid exists to create an energy infrastructure that we can all have our computers on and charge our mobile phones. Apple exists both to sell products to its consumers and to create profit for its shareholders. So, all organisations that we're going to be talking about, all formal organisations, have a purpose. They have a purpose often for society, often for their members, and often for people who aren't their members, and people who aren't general society. We call those people customers. So these are the two elements of the definition, right, that we're going to be focusing on. The formal organisations that we're trying to explain have systems of coordination and they have an explicit goal. Okay. Now, in the theory of organisation, one of the starting points, which we might as well cover now, is known as the goal model of organisations. And what it tells us is that these two elements, coordination and a goal, actually interact with each other. For many, and you'll see this if you look at any of the suggested readings, for many definitions of organisations, they start from the idea that people get together with a purpose, and then to achieve that purpose or that goal, they start to coordinate their activities. And this is a common way of defining organisations, that they are in some way systems of coordinated activity designed around a goal. So once you get the goal, people come together and say, right, here's what we want to do. Then they start to say, well, how can we do it? We need to have specific roles. We need to divide the work up so that you do this, I do that, you do this. We need to coordinate when things are going to happen, so you do your thing before I do my thing. And we start to have systems of coordination. Now, this is a really nice way of thinking about organisations. It's been heavily criticised by so many writers for a variety of reasons, right? So, one, goals change. Two, often organisations, particularly big organisations, have multiple goals, sometimes goals which contradict each other. Take the University of Nottingham. We have the goal of running a surplus, making a profit. We have the goal of delivering education. Sometimes there are things we want to do which cost a lot of money, and contradict our other goals. So you see, it's very rarely the case that people start an organisation with a goal. Equally, it's more commonly the case that people just join an organisation that already exists and they don't continually discuss their goals. But for a starting point, the goal model of organisations is a kind of useful way to get into our discussion. And what it starts to show us is some of the elements that we're going to talk about later on. So, how do you divide the work up? How do you make sure people have done the work that they're supposed to have done? How do you coordinate and track that is all happening? So when you start to think through the goal model, you start to get to issues around leadership, structure, culture, bureaucracy, loads of topics that we're going to be covering later on in the course. But for now, let's just summarise. We're looking in this course at formal organisations, so the behaviour of formal organisations and how people's behaviour changes when they enter formal organisations. Formal organisations, we're going to say, have a goal or a purpose that's explicit, that's stated, and they have formal systems of coordination that tell people within the organisation how to act. Hi everyone, in this short video I'm going to talk about why we make you study organisations and organisational behaviour in a business school. Now there's commonly three reasons that people put forward when they're teaching organisational behaviour as justifying the importance of the subject, and I'm going to go through them because it kind of seems like what I should do. But I want to add to that one of my own. So let's think about them. Did I say three? I meant there's two, maybe two or three. We'll count them in a bit. Right, the first one is, if you think about our definition of organisations and the types of organisations that we're going to be covering on the course, the types of objects that we class as organisations, it should probably be clear to you that they are just important in the world, right? Organisations are how we get most things done in our lives. It's organisations that provide food for us. It's organisations that sell us clothes. It's organisations that allow us to communicate with each other, that provide mobile phones and the systems that coordinate mobile phones. It's organisations that gather the knowledge to develop those systems. So, you know, a kind of superficial answer to why study organisations is because they're important. Socially, culturally, economically, they are important things to us. So, you know, an obvious answer to why you might want to study organisations is because chances are you're going to be in an organisation at some point in your life, right? This has another consequence, right? We spend so much of our own time in organisations that it's actually useful for our personal growth and our ability to reflect on ourselves to understand how our behaviour might change when we're in those organisations, to be able to reflect on our own effectiveness working in organised settings. So the first reason to think about organisations then is one about, I would call it self-awareness, right? That you have lived for most of your life in an organisation. It's going to have some effect on you. Or maybe it doesn't, but it'd be good to think it through. And that's one of the benefits of coming to university, is it's an organisation outside of the world where you can sit and reflect on things. Think about yourself, think about what you want to do with your life, think about what you're proud of, pleased with, and happy about. So that's the first reason, right? Organisations are ubiquitous, they're everywhere, they're important, they affect our behaviour, the behaviour of the people, and if we want to understand ourselves and other people, we need to understand organisations. The second reason is more of an instrumental reason. Many of you that come to a business school probably want to work in a business. Maybe you want to create a business. Well, almost all of those businesses will be organisations at some point. If you get a job working for one of the major management consultancies, you're going to be working in a formal organisation. Even if you create your own business, probably your clients will be organisations. Probably you'll need to work with organisations to develop your service or product, distribute it, so on and so forth. Even just getting payment for your product, you'll probably have to work with an organisation. So there's an instrumental reason. By instrumental I mean there's a purpose other than just because you want to understand organisations. They'll help you do something. Understanding how organisations work can help you navigate your way to the top of an organisation, right? It can be the secret to your success. Understanding organisational decision making can help you sell your product to an organisation. So, in terms of your career, understanding organisations is important. But even before you get to your career, right, you're currently in an organisation that works in peculiar ways. Your ability to succeed at university isn't just dependent on your, brilliance. It's dependent on your ability to work within the University of Nottingham and its systems and its processes. So understanding organisations can even help you within university. So there you go, right? We've got the first reason: organisations are ubiquitous, and that leads to self-awareness. I think you could split them into two, but I'm going to say they're one for the same purpose of this video. And then you've got an instrumental reason. Organisations are key to the kinds of success that I'm guessing many of you want to have in your academic and professional careers. Finally, and this is kind of my personal view, right? Organisations, when you look at them, are really complicated, confusing, fascinating things. They're really important, as we've seen, right? If you want to make the world better, you have to make organisations better, but that's much easier said than done. There's lots of truisms and cliches that people say, particularly in management, about how organisations work. But then when you start to think them through, you realise it's much more complicated than that. And so my personal take, and I'm somebody that, like you guys and girls, I was a undergraduate in a management school, and the more I started to read about and learn about organisations, the more I just thought there were interesting things to try to understand. In the same way that somebody in physics might think space is really just kind of interesting because they want to understand it, and it's not easy to understand. Organisations are the same for me. Now, I appreciate that might not be true of everybody, but I'm guessing that you came into business school, those of you that are in the business school, because you actually want to understand how organisations work, how businesses work, because you're fascinated, because you're interested in it. And that to me is the third reason, right? So we've got a reason to do with self-awareness and understanding yourself. We've got an instrumental reason about your success. And then we've hopefully got another reason, which is just curiosity. They're kind of cool. Maybe cool's not the right word, but they're cool for nerds. Nerds can be cool, right? It's nothing wrong with being a nerd. So they're interesting things. So those are the three reasons why I think it's useful and interesting to engage with organisations. Maybe you've got some other reasons, maybe you don't agree with those reasons, but they're the reasons that people tend to put forward. And that's what you're studying. Okay, so in this video we're going to talk about where the theories that we're going to cover on organisational behaviour have come from. We're going to think about how the study of formal organisations has evolved over time and how it relates to business and management practice. So generally speaking, when we talk about organisation behaviour as a field of study, the first thing to note actually is that some people don't call it organisational behaviour. You'll also see it called organisation studies, organisation theory, organisation science. You might sometimes call it MOS, management and organisation science. There's a whole host of different names. We'll call it organisational behaviour for the purpose of this course. And I like that because it focuses on thinking about how organisations behave and how people in organisations behave. So that field of study, whatever you want to call it, it's kind of it's a hybrid, it's an inter or multidisciplinary body of thinking. What we're going to see as this course develops is we're going to engage with philosophers, we're going to engage with political scientists, sociologists, psychologists, management thinkers, administrative scientists, economists, anthropologists, goodness me, every ist you could think of. And that is kind of understandable if you think about how organisations have developed, right? It's also understandable if you think about why it's important to study organisations. They're ubiquitous. Organisations are everywhere. they're involved with economics, they're involved with shaping culture, they're involved with delivering social goods. So they pick up on all these different disciplines, and it means that the study of organisations can be kind of tricky for students, because you're kind of going to have to become a little bit of a jack of all trades, and that's, for me and Lubna to support you in developing your understanding of these different disciplines. So when we talk about organisational behaviour, you'll often see people say that it's a kind of meeting point, like a Venn diagram between some psychology, some sociology, some economics, some anthropology, and other disciplines. But that's actually evolved over time, and I think there's a nice story that I found useful in thinking about organisations to understand this evolution. So here's my sort of whistle-stop tour of the development of organisation studies to help explain how it looks today. So there's always been an interest in understanding how people form groups and get things done. Going back, to ancient Greece, ancient China, we've got texts which address this very issue. Texts like The Republic by Plato or Aristotle, I can't remember which one of the Greeks. There are plenty of texts from around the world addressing this question that are centuries old. But by the Industrial Revolution in the West, by the Industrial Revolution in Europe, the UK, North America, we start to see the development, not of people discussing how and why people form groups, but questions specifically being asked about how best to design organisations. And there's a whole host of reasons for that, but primarily it goes alongside technological developments, right? During the Industrial Revolution, or the Industrial Revolutions, we should say, a number of processes happened, one of which was the integration of technology into production. People started to think about designing production processes efficiently, whether that was farming, developing techniques or machinery to make farming more efficient, whether it was producing new products and using factory production. Organisations groups of people started to think very carefully, not just about doing stuff, but about how they were doing stuff. And this led to engineers, it led to lots of entrepreneurs and innovations designing new technologies. Well, it was a very short step from designing new technologies and innovating technologies to thinking about how do we innovate, how do we make decisions most efficiently within the organisation. And it was here that you start to get people like Adam Smith talking about the importance of a division of labour. You start to get people like Robert Owen talking about the use of machinery as being emancipatory and freeing people up so that they can devote themselves to higher callings rather than just producing stuff. And you also saw the development of what was called scientific management, which I'm sure you've probably heard about in some of your other courses, and if you haven't, I'm sure you will. But scientific management for our purposes was a particular shift where managers or owners of organisations started to think about, can they redesign what people are doing? Can they redesign what we called earlier on the coordination of activities more efficiently? And to start off with, they took a model from engineering. So they like to think of organisations almost as it's like machines that you could fine tune and you could create efficiencies in. This is in organisation studies, or organisation behaviour is sometimes called classic management theory. So it assumes that organisations are like a machine, and then you can use the tools of engineering and science to improve the workings of those machines. And that, historically, was really effective. When formal organisations started to be organised around scientific management principles, they became way more productive. They could make loads more things, loads cheaper, people could buy more things, and everybody apparently was getting happier and happier. And yet at the same time, actually in those organisations, people were becoming more and more unhappy, and we started to see, actually, it's quite forgotten now, particularly amongst students of business, but there were very bloody pitched battles between workers and owners. In the States, but also many other countries, formal organisations would literally call in the army to attack striking workers who were complaining about being treated like machines. The kind of founding father of scientific management actually once said that he assumed workers were like wooden men. They were just, they had no thoughts, no emotions, no feelings. He said at one point as well that workers could be treated like sort of moderately intelligent gorillas. They were just power. They were just muscles and bodies. That was it. That was all organisation theory was interested in, and it drew on the skills of engineers. But these kinds of the bloody battles, and I've got some linked in the notes that happened, started to turn managers' attention to thinking about organisations not just as machines, but to thinking of them as societies almost, where there was politics, power struggles, emotions, feelings, and all these things started to become important. And managers started then not just to turn to engineers, but to other disciplines like psychologists to try to help them understand how could they re-engineer workers' emotions. How could they re-engineer their organisation so that it wasn't a fractious, conflict-ridden entity, but actually people got on with each other. And it was here that they turned primarily to sociologists. So this was in the sort of start of the 20th century, probably around like the 1920s. So you had things like Sigmund Freud developing psychoanalysis. You had people like Elton Mayo applying that idea to organisations, going in and realising that when people were at work, they weren't just there for pay, they were there to speak to people, they were there to form social connections with people. So Mayo was involved in the Hawthorne studies, which I think you probably would have covered elsewhere on the courses, but for those of you that didn't, on the Hawthorne studies they were looking to see the effect of changing lighting on production in a factory. So this was a very scientific management approach. If you make the lighting more bright, do people work faster? But what they found was that whether they made the lighting bright or dark, it didn't matter. In each case, people worked harder and harder. And the researchers concluded that the reason people worked harder was because they felt like when the managers were changing the light, that the managers were showing they cared about their workers. And when they felt like they were cared for, they were more committed to the job. So we start to see organisation studies, or studies of organisations, which draw on psychological theory and sociological theories. And there's a whole host of them that we could go through, but the point here is that what you start to get is people that were interested in understanding human psychology, economics, sociology, culture, anthropology, realising that there was a potential impact of their research on business. So I think current Dean of Harvard Business School, Caruana, he wrote a book about this in the American context, and he talks about how these academics became sort of hired hands. So he's kind of playing on the invisible hand line that Adam Smith talks about. He said they became hired hands of managers. And the result is that probably sort of from the 1920s through to the war, you started to see sociological terms and concepts being applied to understand organisations. But post the Second World War, getting a bit mixed up, loads more people became interested in developing organisations, and then you start to see the development of organisation studies as a specific field of study. It's by the 1970s that we get the first professor of organisation behaviour in the UK. We start to get journals dedicated to organisation studies and human relations, organisation science, organisation theory. But what this means is, and this is kind of going to be maybe a little bit complicated for you guys, but when people are talking about organisations in organisation studies, they're often coming from very different perspectives. Burrell and Morgan talk about this in terms of paradigms, or Morgan elsewhere talks about it in terms of metaphors. The idea here is that each of these disciplines approaches organisations as a particular type of thing. So we've already talked about the scientific managers approaching organisations as if they were machines. Well, other disciplines have their own kind of metaphors, their own thinking of organisations as something. And there's a debate that we're now having in organisation studies about whether those different metaphors and paradigms can be put together, whether they're separate. Now, I kind of think of it like there's this old parable, I think it's an Indian parable, of the blind men and the elephant. The idea that there's a group of blind men and they meet an elephant, and one touches it and says it's hard and it's big, I think it's a wall, and the other touches the nose, is it called a nose? The spout, the nose, and water shoots out of it, and he says, I think it's a fountain. The other sees the tail swooshing around and says, I think it's a fan. Now, of course, they can only see their little bit. You put them together, you don't necessarily get an elephant. An elephant isn't a wall fountain with a fan. This is a live debate, and one that you guys might like to think about. But you might also like to think about whether you have your own preferences for particular approaches, for particular ways of thinking about organisations. Now, I really like this guy called Morgan, and I always get confused if it's Gareth or Glenn, because there's two of them. I think it's Glenn Morgan. And his work on metaphors. So his argument is actually one of the most practical skills that we can teach you as students of organisations, as hopefully managers and leaders of the future, is to have the ability to shift between different metaphors, to be able to walk into a setting, walk into an event in an organisation and think, is this a problem which needs an engineering perspective, a problem that's a psychological problem? Is it a sociological problem? Is it an anthropological problem? And that you can shift between them all. So that rather than thinking you have to put them all together to come up with a single answer, what we would call synthesis, that actually it's better to have a range of different tools in your toolbox. And that's one way of increasing your professional and personal effectiveness in organisations. And that's actually, hopefully those of you that have looked at how the course is organised, kind of what we're trying to do on the course. We're trying to teach you different concepts, different ways of looking, different theories of organisations, but we're not asking you necessarily to pick the one right one or to put them all together to make a composite beast. Rather, we want to see your ability to shift between them all, and that's one of the skills that we're trying to cultivate with you. So there you go, that's a very quick whistle-stop tour, but the headline is organisation studies is a very vibrant and multidisciplinary subject which draws on a range of different theories to look at organisations from a variety of different perspectives. And on this course we're going to try to cover some of the key perspectives.